Hi class, welcome to week 2. This week we're going to begin our study of project stakeholder management and look at stakeholder management in the project initiation and planning stages of the project lifecycle. As I mentioned in the week 1 lecture, we've all been stakeholders in a project at some time or another, or at least you can probably identify a stakeholder in a project. Now that you know what a project is and what a stakeholder is, you could probably identify a project stakeholder. But the thing is, do we really understand what a stakeholder is, what the stakeholder might need, how the stakeholder can positively or negatively influence the project? That's what's involved in our project stakeholder management, and it begins with properly identifying the stakeholders of your project and assessing just their influence on the project. So to put it in a definition, the identify stakeholder process is the process of identifying the people, the groups, and the organizations. Don't forget that organizations are also stakeholders in projects. All these could impact or could be impacted by the project, a decision, activity, or even the outcome of the project. And although the identify stakeholder process is technically part of the planning process group, I really wanted to bring this process into the conversation now at the beginning of the project life cycle, at the initiation of the project. Because we have already developed our project charter at project initiation, and all the key stakeholders have identified the requirements of the project and agreed upon the contents of the project charter, it's pretty much a given that we understand and know who our key project stakeholders are at this time. And so with the approval of the project charter, we can probably identify a handful of key stakeholders for this project at this time. Of course, the further identification, stakeholder identification will, and the assessment will take place further into the project planning cycle. This does give us a good start on how to identify, or who is identified as the key stakeholders of the project at the project initiation. You learn about your stakeholders by analyzing and documenting the information relative to the stakeholders' interest, their involvement, the interdependencies between the stakeholders, the influence, and of course the potential impact that the project stakeholder has on the success of the project. The major inputs to this process, to identify and assess project stakeholders, would be, of course, the project charter, which we just talked about as having been developed. We know who our key stakeholders are. And then procurement documents. With procurement documents, we know who's involved in working on the project, who's supplying us with resources or with materials. So we know those people are going to be stakeholders in our project, or those organizations are going to be key stakeholders. And so the major outputs to this process would include, of course, the identification information of the stakeholders, such as the name, the organization, the position the stakeholder holds in this organization, the contact information of the stakeholder. And of course, then you're also going to have the assessment information that you gained from identifying and assessing your project stakeholders. That would be like their major requirements and their expectations in the project. How the stakeholder could influence the outcomes of the project. And of course, the stage or the project life cycle, the stage of the project life cycle that the stakeholder has the most influence or the most impact. You really want to know, can they impact your project at execution, or could they impact it at closure? Such as maybe a stakeholder has to approve a certain deliverable at project closure. That key stakeholder obviously has high impact and high influence on your project success at that point. Also, you would know the classification of your stakeholder as an output of this process, such as whether the project stakeholder is internal or external to the organization, what their impact, influence, and power interests classification might be. So those are the things that you'll look for as outputs to your stakeholder identification and assessment process. And of course, the PMBOK, the PMBOK does provide a good step-by-step process for identification and analysis of your project stakeholders. And you really should examine the section in the PMBOK that summarizes those classification models that are used in stakeholder identification and analysis. Of course, it helps you determine how to manage your stakeholder communications and ultimately the stakeholder expectations. Now this module this week will cover key steps in identifying stakeholders and prioritizing your project stakeholder by the power, the influence, and the interest in the project outcome. And then you'll develop a strategy to plan and execute to engage your stakeholders. We don't really manage stakeholders, we just manage the engagement that comes along with the project stakeholders. It's pretty hard to manage a stakeholder. You might lead your project team, but you don't really manage a customer, you don't manage your project sponsor. You manage those expectations that those stakeholders have. So just remember that we don't manage the actual people or the organizations, we manage those expectations. And although we're really concerned right now with just identifying and assessing our project stakeholders at the initiation and planning stage of the project, just remember that the scope of stakeholder engagement management and the activities that go along with it really does extend from project initiation phase to the project completion. You're continually identifying and assessing your project stakeholders. So it's just not a one-time thing. It happens throughout the project and should be a part of your routine business and processes in managing your project. So the key topics that we'll explore this week include understanding the stakeholder engagement process, the types of stakeholders you might see and their roles and influence and power in your project, identifying and categorizing and prioritizing your stakeholders. Not every stakeholder has the same level of priority. Their category is going to tell you what their priority is. Project sponsor is a high priority. Your project customer is a high priority, but not every stakeholder has that same level of priority. And then how we're going to gather information about our stakeholders and how we're going to assess the stakeholder strengths and weaknesses in the project. So what you really can expect to learn in this module and how this will carry over into week 3 learning is you want to analyze the nature of stakeholder groups and summarize their impact on project performance. And remember, it's always that impact on project performance, whether it be increase the risk in a project. You might have to have stakeholders might influence your project budget, so that's going to obviously impact your project performance in some ways, or they might impact the time or duration of your project. We want to be able to choose from among a suite of appropriate strategies. We need to build our strategies for managing our stakeholder engagement, and then recommend the approach that's appropriate based upon our stakeholder strengths and our weaknesses and the impact on the project. And then other categories of stakeholder characteristics, such as the priority and authority. All project stakeholders have different levels of authority in the project, so we need to be aware of that and be able to manage that as well. And then, given a project, the specific project context, we need to be able to create a stakeholder engagement plan. We really do need to have, based on all this identification analysis, we really need to develop a plan of how we're going to engage and manage that engagement of our stakeholders. And that includes, stuff like processes such as manage the communication with our stakeholders, look at the ethics related to stakeholder engagement, and the leadership that comes along with managing the engagement of our stakeholders. So what you're going to do is you're going to apply the concepts that we learned this week to our course project case problem as you identify the stakeholders in this case and conduct a a project stakeholder analysis, identification and analysis. And then armed with this information, you're going to prepare a stakeholder register, a stakeholder management strategy, and that will include the stakeholder analysis matrix. And these can all be found in the PMBOK and the Larson and Gray textbook. So search those out. I don't want to bore you with putting this on the screen and showing you what one is, but search those out in the textbook, and we'll talk about it. If you have questions about it, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But for this week, it's just going to be a draft. You'll draft your stakeholder management strategy, stakeholder register, and your analysis. And then once I have a chance to look at it and provide you with feedback, you'll take this and submit it in week 3 for in a final version for grading. And I really want you to make sure that you prepare this in one document only in Microsoft Word. If you have to develop a table, tables are real simple and easy to make in Microsoft Word. So do that in Microsoft Word, all in one document where it's self-contained, so you don't have to go to 3 different documents to look at this, the stakeholder information. Because the stakeholder management plan will be inserted in your project management plan. It's just a subsidiary plan, and it needs to be all contained within that PMP so that you have one document and it's easy to find everything in that document. So, I'm glad you're here for week 2, and we'll get started talking about stakeholder engagement and managing that engagement, and we'll have a good discussion. So, see you in the course.